Hi everyone, this is Dr. Stefan. Welcome to another video. In this one, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about familial pulmonary fibrosis again, but barriers to having genomic testing, some otherwise known as genetic testing. So, testing the genes to find out whether there is a predisposition in a family for getting pulmonary fibrosis. So, things like idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis, all these things can be genetically, you can be genetically predisposed to getting these conditions. And these things can run in the family. So obviously, there are some tests available to look at the DNA to see whether these predispositions exist, and some of them have already been described in scientific journals, papers, etc. There's quite a lot of information in this regard. However, there are a lot of barriers to testing people for these predispositions. So sometimes we are actually running blind because we think there may be a predisposition in the family. For example, a patient presents to their doctor with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, let's say, and they mention that their brother, their father, an uncle, someone else in the family, they all had pulmonary fibrosis. We can probably safely assume that there is a predisposition in that family for this condition. But if we have a test and we cannot run it, it's a little bit tricky because we just note that there is predisposition and we cannot do that much about it because we don't really know what the exact predisposition is, whether that family could potentially take part in a research project, a clinical trial, to look at new drugs, new treatments, new interventions, lifestyle changes that could prevent further, to slow down the decline of their conditions, prevent other family members from getting these conditions, or at least delaying that situation further and further. So it's really, really important to raise awareness of familial pulmonary fibrosis. And I try to do this through this channel and my other videos. I have another channel. If you look up my name, Stefan Christian Stanel, you can find this other channel where I place other videos about lung disease, and I try to raise awareness of familial pulmonary fibrosis because it's really, really important. I try to work in a familial ILD clinic. We're trying to build this up here in Manchester in the UK, and it's tricky. Believe me, in practice, it's really tricky to organize genomic tests. Even if the tests are available, sometimes there can be a lot of barriers. So if we think about familial pulmonary fibrosis, it's actually a fairly common condition if we ask about it. So many clinicians, unfortunately, do not have the time or maybe the skills or the confidence to really delve into the family history very much. And sometimes it's important to raise awareness. This is our job, maybe as doctors, as clinicians, to talk to other clinicians about this. But I think patients also don't volunteer family history information sometimes. Sometimes it can be related to confidentiality issues, not wanting to share too much. But sometimes it can really affect what we're doing later on in treating conditions. So it's really important because there are certain genes that can carry variants. So in certain families in our DNA, there may be genes that have mutations. Although the word mutation usually has a very dark sort of tone to it, so we tend to use the term variant, because everyone is a little bit different. So maybe my genomic code will be a little bit different than yours. So if there is something that really is outside the norm for either of us, for example, that would be called a variant. And then those variants can have more or less clinical significance. So you may have just a variant that doesn't really affect how your body is behaving, or you may have something that has a more significance clinically. So we can run these tests. They exist. In the case of familial pulmonary fibrosis, we generally talk about telomere-related genes, telomere shortening, and another gene called MOC5B. So it's not really important to know these details, just to let you know that there are tests out there that exist. And we can measure some things, for example, just to understand whether someone would be potentially predisposed to pulmonary fibrosis. But who gets these tests? This is the real problem, because in real life, it's really difficult. And I work in the United Kingdom, for example, and even with the resources of the UK, organizing genomic testing, even here, can be difficult. So you can believe that in other countries, things are even more complicated. Now, personally, my native country is Romania. So Romania is more or less a middle income country. And even there, genomic testing is really, really sparsely distributed. For some conditions, you cannot get it. You need to send tests abroad. It's really expensive. And you can imagine in countries that have even less resources, the situation is much worse. So if you're thinking along those lines, we really need to work on trying to understand our DNA better, to understand how these predispositions actually work in real life and what tests we can run. Because in real life, even in the UK and in very developed countries, most of the genomic testing that is done for familial pulmonary fibrosis is done as part of research projects. So it's not covered by the clinical systems, by the healthcare system. So patients either volunteer for a research project, or sometimes they need to pay out of pocket to get certain tests done. And there are limited panels of genes that can be tested for variants or mutations, as we discussed before, but these are fairly limited. So in the UK, for familial pulmonary fibrosis, we do have a genomic panel that covers quite a lot of genes. However, even in that sense, it can be difficult to organize because of lack of awareness sometimes and other things. So we do encourage, generally in real life, patients to sign up for whatever tests are available as part of the health system, which are covered, and then to maybe consider taking part in research projects where we have the possibility to maybe add other things on top. So having knowledge of what genetic predisposition may exist in a family where there are several cases of pulmonary fibrosis is really important, because first of all, it may give you an answer as to why me? Why did I get ILD? I think that's reassuring in some way. Even if it doesn't change the outcome of the condition, at least there's an explanation. And psychologically, it's easier to accept having a diagnosis that can be potentially detrimental, a condition that can progress, make you feel really unwell. And then there are certain clinical implications as well. So for instance, people who carry genetic predispositions for familial pulmonary fibrosis may suffer with other conditions as well. So they may be more carefully screened for things like hematological disease, blood disorders, liver disease, autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis and scleroderma, other things. They may also have a poor response to immunosuppression, so taking medication that reduces the immune response, because some of these predispositions are tightly linked with how our body's immune system operates. So it may have a clinical implication. Then patients who have predispositions may actually have a faster progression of their lung fibrosis over time. So they may be listed for a transplant, for a lung transplant faster. So there's a lot of things that we can actually look at if we know that there's a predisposition there, and we can define it and quantify it and, put a name to it actually, rather than saying, yes, there are brothers, sisters, and other family members who have the same problem. It's important to maybe dig a little bit deeper. And I think we're taking the first steps in that direction, but there are still a lot of barriers. So what are some of these barriers? The first one, in my opinion, is, and this is my opinion. So in this video, I'm not necessarily sharing the opinions of people I work with, the hospital where I'm employed at. It's just my own personal opinion based on what I've seen in real life. One major thing that I think is a barrier for more genomic testing that could potentially help people down the line is lack of awareness. And this is important because it goes in both areas of doctor and patient. So both doctors and patients do not have a lot of awareness, unfortunately, on a general level about predispositions for familial pulmonary fibrosis. So we need a lot more patient engagement, so engaging with support groups, with charities, with other organizations who can educate the wider population, the general public, about predispositions to various conditions, including interstitial lung diseases, pulmonary fibrosis. Doctor engagement is also really important. So this is more for us as clinicians to talk to our colleagues to explain that there are predispositions we can test for. So this can be done at conferences, meetings. There is also a need to maybe have more press engagement, have more press releases and discussions with journalists who may reach a wider audience than we can as doctors. So obviously I'm trying through this YouTube channel, but I only have a very limited audience so far. then we need to think about health policy and health system funders. How do we talk to them and demonstrate that testing patients for genetic predispositions for certain conditions such as pulmonary fibrosis can be cost effective, can be beneficial for better outcomes in the health system overall, because this is really important. We cannot unfortunately test for everything and have everything that we want, but at least if we can demonstrate that it can potentially save some money, because the money is limited in any health system and we have to be aware of that. If we can demonstrate that we can choose the right tests to improve outcomes, that may actually go a long way. Another barrier that's really important, and I've touched upon this before, is access to genomic testing. So this is obviously the first thing that people think about, maybe after lack of awareness. The cost for genomic testing can be quite high depending on the tests that are run, but the cost is coming down. So this is really, really important. So there are tests that can be run relatively cheaply at the moment, especially if we are targeting certain panels of genes. So not sequencing the entire DNA. That's still quite expensive. And even though the price has come down quite a lot, it's still probably beyond the means of general health systems and what we can offer to the general public. But if we screen potentially patients who may benefit the most from these tests, so by asking about family history, by talking to the patient more carefully to determine whether they have a lot of features that may suggest a genomic variant may be found, then we can actually test those people and actually save costs by not randomly testing, but just focusing our testing to certain groups which are more at risk. The other problem about access to tests is not only about the cost. So sometimes in certain countries around the world, there is limited genetics expertise and very few labs who can actually run the tests in a well-standardized fashion. So obviously, living in the UK, there is plenty of access to genomic testing in universities, in university labs, NHS, National Health Service labs, and other institutions. In other countries, it's not the same. So I can tell you, for example, back home in Romania, where I'm from, there is much less access to genomic testing. It can be done, but it's much more limited than in the UK. And then in other developing countries, it's probably even more difficult. It's probably worse. So that's the other thing, because in some countries which are low middle income, you may need to send the tests abroad. So you may need to collect a blood sample from a patient and send it abroad somewhere to Germany, to the United States, somewhere really far away. And that can increase the cost for the testing in those specific countries. So again, it's a big problem. Another barrier to having more genetic testing for familial pulmonary fibrosis is ethical concerns. So obviously we cannot randomly test people, and then some people are worried about what will the results mean to them, for their children. We need to be able to discuss with our patients. We cannot just randomly test blood. So we need to have procedures in place in order to make sure that it is an informed consent for having a genomic test. We cannot just take some blood and do a test. The patient needs to understand what that means to them, how it can change and affect their lives and the lives of their family members. Because you can imagine, if someone is a little bit vulnerable and suddenly is told by their parent, for example, that, well, I've had this test, I have this predisposition, you may get it as well. That can be really troubling for someone. So we need to be careful to have these conversations beforehand, only communicating results in a very formal setting, I would say, with access to a genetician, a genetic counselor, someone who can explain what the results mean, how things can change in a person's life, how things can be improved, for example, in terms of lifestyle, because there are things that can be done. So it's not the end of the world if a genetic predisposition is found, but we need to be careful about how we approach this. Again, testing minors is a different thing. So there are various rules and regulations around this all over the world. So it depends on the country, on the region. We need to take into account these ethical concerns and try to see if we can develop a standardized approach that works in most places around the world. So there may be religious barriers to testing as well. So all of these things we need to take into account. We cannot just blindly roll out genomic testing on a wide scale without considering the wider ethical and societal implications. The other thing that kind of ties into this as well as a barrier is fear. So many, if you've ever signed a consent form for a research project, there is a lot of information that is provided to you as a participant in a research project. And basically, researchers need to go the extra mile to prove that they're going to use the data that they generate through the research project or through a test that they run for ethical purposes. That some people may have fears around whether someone will use their blood for cloning, for animal testing, for all these things. So we need to make sure that these things are explained, that the information that is provided, the scope of the research is very well defined, the scope of testing is really well defined to minimize the fear. Because there have been, unfortunately, instances in the past when research has gone crazy, and we all really need to prevent that and improve the confidence in research, really, because it can improve lives dramatically if it's done in the proper way. Then another barrier that I think is important is the fact that familial pulmonary fibrosis is a complex condition. So we need to think about other conditions which may be tied into the same predisposition. So sometimes people may suffer with familial pulmonary fibrosis, but some other family members may have leukemia. They may have different cancers. They may have other conditions which may tie into the same predisposition. So a person may see actually different specialists for different health problems. The specialists may not talk to each other very well, so it may be difficult to pick the exact genes to test for based on the conditions that are there. Or one specialist may have access to certain tests, and they may run those tests. For example, for patients who suffer with leukemia, there's a lot more genetic testing for various blood cancers, blood disorders. But then those predispositions may not tie in very well with the familial pulmonary fibrosis, or the other way around. So things need to be discussed in a wider context, ideally through collaboration between different specialists, because this communication between, for example, myself as a pulmonologist and a hematologist and a rheumatologist, an immunologist, can be tricky. It can be tricky because we don't work all together in the same hospital sometimes, and we're not in the same room with the patient. We cannot really take into account everything. Another important barrier that I think needs to be outlined is the fact that patients sometimes need to travel great distances to have these tests done. Because generally, we need to inform the patients. They need to be told what the tests may mean. So we need a specific consultation. So we need to see them face-to-face generally to collect the blood sample afterwards. So you can imagine if a patient needs to travel for 5-6 hours or more to get a genetic test, some may do that, but a lot of people may find that's beyond their means. It's affecting their lives tremendously, especially if they are ill. To travel that long a distance is difficult. So maybe whether we can develop a system in which we can take a consent remotely by having certain procedures in place to ensure that that is done appropriately, and that the blood sample is taken and shipped from the local clinic or something like that, that could work. But it's still a huge barrier, even in developed countries such as the UK. I can tell you this from personal experience. The other barrier that I think is really important here, but it's not a barrier, more of an opportunity, I would say, that we need to really work on and improve, is the informed consent process for genomic testing. So this ties in again with the travel and minimizing the complications that arise with performing tests, because we need to provide the right information for the patients. Sometimes you can find companies that are online and they say that they will test your blood. They can send you a test kit in the mail, and you can swab the inner side of your cheek, send that back to them, and they will give you a result. Sure, that result may be valid, but sometimes you are offered these results with no interpretation whatsoever, and the company has very limited responsibility in terms of what the results may mean to you. So this is why I think it's really ideal that the genetic testing is done by involving specialists. Genetic counseling is really important. So if a variant, a mutation is found, someone can explain to you what that may mean in your case, and also to tell you whether they know or don't know what the variant means, because there are things that we sometimes identify through genomic testing that we cannot really explain. We don't have enough research to cover what that means. So that's really important to think about how we can improve the information that we provide to patients who consent for genetic testing, and how we can make that informed consent process run more smoothly, to also allow potentially for remote consent or electronic consent or things like that, because that will help with distance and travel. And the final thing before I finish is, another barrier may be that we still are in a position where we can only run limited tests. And these unfortunately can miss certain genes. So obviously, if we are testing the whole DNA, if we're doing whole genome sequencing, that is ideal, but that's still quite expensive, even though the cost is coming down. And if we do a whole genome sequence, if we test the whole DNA, we would then need another specialist involved, a bioinformatician, who can handle that huge amount of data that comes from that result and feedback to the clinician to understand what is really relevant. Because you can imagine, if we look at the entire DNA, the complexity is huge. So at the moment, we have limited tests that cover maybe 20 genes, 30 genes, small panels that look at specific genes associated with certain conditions. And we have that for familial pulmonary fibrosis as well. For example, at this moment, in August 2023 in the UK, we have a 25 gene panel that we can run for familial pulmonary fibrosis. But again, there may be predispositions that are outside of the scope of this test that we do not test for. So a negative result does not mean that a predisposition isn't there. It's just, it could be related to a gene that we didn't test for. Or if we run this panel, we may actually get a result that's positive, let's say, or there is a variant found for a gene that maybe doesn't have such a clear connection with familial pulmonary fibrosis, and then we need to interpret that result in the context of that specific family. So this is where it becomes complex. We need to integrate any result that we receive with the clinical data. So it becomes a rather complex matrix of, we have these genetic variants, these test results on the one hand, we have the clinical data on the other hand, we have a genetic counselor, we have a clinician who can be a pulmonologist, maybe another clinician who is in a different specialty, and we all try to work together to put all of these bits of information into a matrix to try to provide an outcome for that patient. What is the risk for them, for their family members? What can they do to actually improve their lives based on this test result? So I hope this was helpful. It's more or less my opinion at this stage about genomic testing for familial pulmonary fibrosis, and I'm pretty sure my knowledge and skills and understanding of this topic will grow as time goes on. But it's something that I'm quite keen and passionate, keen to learn about, passionate to learn about, and I try in real life to work with patients with familial pulmonary fibrosis and try to provide more information through this platform, to this channel, my other social media and YouTube content, because I think this is where we need to work on initially, raising awareness about familial pulmonary fibrosis, genomic testing, and how this can influence outcomes in the long run. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you all the best.